Namaste and welcome everyone to this introductory talk on the works of Mahamahopadhyaya Acharya Sri Pullela Sriramachandrudu. Pullela Sriramachandrudu is a very well-known scholar in Sanskrit and Telugu and very popular in the Telugu states of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And through this talk, we are trying to introduce his works and his life, so on, for a larger audience, so that we get to understand who our own native luminaries are, be it in Sanskrit, be it in Dharmic studies, be it in Alankarashastra, Shastra. Pullela Sriramachandrudu is a Padma Sri awardee, and his writing spans across various languages, primarily between Sanskrit, Telugu, and English, with a large contribution into the Telugu literature space. If we look at the domains that his work really spans across, it is you'll find a lot of works on Alankarashastra, where he has translated a lot of original works from Sanskrit into Telugu for the benefit of Telugu audience, be it Telugu researchers or anybody interested in getting to know more on Alankarashastra. He has also done a lot of work on Shastra, and he's translated a whole bunch of works on Vedanta and Bhagavad Gita, and he's also translated works on our Itihasas, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Dharma Sastras, works on Jainism, works on Buddhism, and then Puranas. It's a wide span of work for him, and this really spans across close to about 175 to 200 books. So I think you can all pretty much imagine how much a person would have put in terms of efforts, thought, and intellect for a corpus of work that really spans across 175 to 200 books. Thanks to Atharva Forum for giving me this opportunity today to talk about a great scholar. And it is particularly more important because in a lot of forums, when we speak in English, we don't talk really about our own native luminaries. And I think this is a great instance where we are getting to talk about our own regional scholars who have really written in the Indian tongue, be it in Telugu, be it in Sanskrit. I'm hoping it will be an opening into his works for a lot of people who are watching this. Just a brief bit about me. I'm just a culture enthusiast trying to understand and stay connected with my roots. I've had a predominantly modern education, and I'm trying to understand the culture of the land, Sanatana Dharma, and Pullela Sriramachandrudu's work. That has been a great anchor for me in trying to understand the culture of this land. And one of the reasons why scholars like Sri Ramachandrudu's work is really important is because if one were to learn about their own tradition, particularly in the Indian context, about our Dharmic traditions, the best way to do is, of course, is to learn through the Deva Bhasha, which is Sanskrit. But then a lot of us may or may not be equipped as much to go to the originals, understand Sanskrit end to end, and then even be in a position to interpret those works. And that's where if you are not competent in Deva Bhasha, I think the next best method to do it is to do this through your Matrubhasha. So in this case, my Matrubhasha is Telugu, and I've been very fortunate to read a lot of works written by Pullela Sriramachandrudu, where he has translated a lot of classical works from Sanskrit into Telugu. And I think the charm about Sri Ramachandrudu's work is that while he is writing in Matrubhasha, he has also written works in Deva Bhasha. He has also written works in English. He's really written works for both scholars and non-scholars alike. So if you look at the people who have been reading Sri Ramachandrudu's work over the years, you would see that there are, let's say, researchers. Maybe there's a research in a PhD department in Telugu literature trying to do a thesis on Alankarashastra, or there may be somebody else somewhere in a department of Sanskrit who is trying to do something on Vyakarana, do something on philosophies. You'll find such people, and then you'll also find people like me who are really trying to understand some of our own traditional works, but don't want to rely on English translations done by Indologists or people with vested interests. For such people, Pullela Sriramachandrudu's work is very, very helpful. In terms of the timeline of his works, he was born in 1927, and he left us in 2015, about 6 years ago. Of course, he continues to stay with us because of the great length of works that he has done. And he's been writing pretty much till 2014. One of his great works on Bharata Muni's Natya Shastram was published in 2014. So he was about 87 years old then. So my father had purchased some of the books of Sri Ramachandrudu about, let's say, in the 70s and 80s. And I continue to buy a lot of his books and read. So you can just imagine the span of his influence on various people in the Telugu country, that let's say people in the 1970s, 60s to now, it's a span of about 60 to 70 years, and there were a huge set of people who have been inspired by his works, and they continue to buy some of his works on Ramayana and Mahabharata, which released let's say in the last decade or so. They are still very widely popular. In fact, his work on Ramayana, where he has translated all the kandas of Valmiki Ramayana into Telugu, that I got it as a wedding gift, and then I had later recommended it as a gifting object for many others. A brief background about Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu's education and how he grew up to what he was. So he had a traditional education at home, and from his father Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu, and he keeps attributing throughout his works, he keeps attributing a lot of his inspiration, learning, and scholarship to the work, to the knowledge that he gained from his father in his childhood. Particularly in a preface or a Prastavana that he has written for the Yudh Kanda, he actually refers to this experience of by the time he was 14, Pullela Garu says that he has heard the Ramayana Pravachanam 3 to 4 times from his own father, and his father Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu has done the Sundarakanda Parayanam hundreds of times, and then the Sampurna Ramayanam's Parayanam multiple times. So he talks about this influence of these pravachanams and parayanams on him even at that young age, and how that influence continued to stay with him as he grew up. So later, from his traditional education with his father, he then moved on to Narendrapuram Sanskrit College in the East Godavari district, where he was taught by Kompella Subbaraya Shastri Garu. And after that, he went to the Mylapore Sanskrit College, the Madras Sanskrit College, and he passed out as a Vedanta Shiromani, and he continued to study Telugu, Hindi, English, so on and so forth. And he went to the Banaras Hindu University, where he also studied the Alankarashastra, and he did his PhD topic was on a very well respected Alankarashastra scholar, Pandit Raja Jagannatha's contribution to Sanskrit poetics. So this is a work called Rasa Gangadhara, on which he has done his PhD talk. And then later, he moved to the Osmania University in Hyderabad, and he became like the key figure for the Department of Sanskrit there. And he has also established a Sanskrit Academy there. He's been very popular and very well known for some of the academies that he has established outside, like the Surabharati Academy, Surabharati Samiti, and then the Sanskrita Bhasha Prachara Samiti, so on. These are all bodies really that have been established to promote Sanskrit, spoken Sanskrit, or Sanskrit works in Telugu, the translations of these works. And this is very important, particularly in the context of, let's say, the past few decades in the Telugu country, where a lot of such education was not really available for a lot of people through their schools, colleges, and universities. So these bodies and the works that they have produced really helped a lot for at least a couple of generations of people to appreciate Sanskrit, to appreciate classical Telugu, and to appreciate their connect with the traditions. Some of the disciples of Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu also ended up as scholars and professors in Sanskrit, in Telugu. In fact, when he got his Padma Sri award, there was a book that was published about Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu's contribution called Padma Sri Puraskrita Pullela Sriramachandrudu. And this really has a lot of people writing about his works and his contribution to literature, Telugu, Sanskrit, so on. We also have a whole lot of patrons. So if you look at any of the books written by Sriramachandrudu Garu, typically he would be dedicating that book to someone, and the initiation or the thought of writing the book also would have come from someone else. And he keeps narrating these stories of how that whole idea came out to be, of how someone approached him, and then how that work came out to be, and why he is dedicating it to so and so person. So you'd see a lot of luminaries, you'll see scholars, you'll see bureaucrats trained in Sanskrit, interested in Sanskrit, so on. You will see justices and all kinds of people. Some of these people, like G. Pullareddy Garu, who is a very well-known household name in the Telugu states. He was known for his Pullareddy sweets, which is widely popular, of course. And then he has established a lot of educational institutions, and he's done stellar social surveys, and he's been known with a very Hindu bodies, spiritual bodies. So there are people like that. There are also people like Alladi Kuppuswamy, who's very well known in the legal circles as a legal luminary, and there's a bunch of such people. So it's very fascinating to see this, how so many people come together to see a work of literature come out. You have a bunch of patrons, you have a bunch of people who are proofreading the book along with Sri Ramachandrudu Garu, and it's a whole set of disciples, and it's really fascinating. And sometimes it feels odd to see what will happen to us as a people if this kind of a Samskriti doesn't, or a parampara doesn't continue for the next few generations. One person whom Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu attributes a lot of inspiration and support for his works in the later years is Sadguru Shivananda Murthy, who is a very widely known spiritual guru and of the Shaivite tradition, and he's again pretty much of the same generation as Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu, and he's very well respected, and he's got his own following, and he's quite some figure within the Telugu states in the past few decades. Now, one very specific aspect of how Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu's work will connect to, let's say, somebody like me or some of you who might be viewing this, who are may not be trained in the classical languages, who may not be trained in Sanskrit, and who are not, who are not scholars, pandits, so on, is this whole concept of a Bala Nandini that Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu came up with, where he calls it a Bala Nandini Telugu Andhra Vyakhyanam. So for every couplet or every shloka from Sanskrit, he gives a very elaborate Vyakhyanam in Telugu, and it's very helpful for anybody to just pick any book and then they can just start going. The kind of language that he uses, though it for somebody from this generation, it might appear a bit more scholarly, but then as you get habituated to it, I think it has its own charm, and really people can get connected to it and learn a lot. I think this Bala Nandini has been a very great innovation, specifically for let's say the past people born out of modern secular school education, who are really deprived of their own Telugu language as well, right? I mean, your own mother tongue you might not be as fluent. So it's not only you get to understand these works, you get to learn your own mother tongue, and you also get to learn Sanskrit as another benefit out of this. In the recent past, I think there has been some attention, thankfully, in the English-speaking space to people like Pullela Garu. Typically, we would hear of him only, let's say, in Telugu journals or Telugu magazines here and there. You wouldn't see somebody in English talking about Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu. And I think in the recent past, there was this article on Dharma Dispatch where Śatāvadhānī Ganesh Garu's article has been put in English, translated into English and put in, which is very interesting for somebody who wants to get to know the context in which Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu's work needs to be appreciated. In fact, in that article, there is one particular line which really stood out for me, that had somebody like Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu done such kind of a work in English, probably he would have had a pattern like the Murthy Classical Library, so on, right? I mean, we typically have a tendency to appreciate people who write in English and far less for people who write in Indian tongue, be it Sanskrit or be it in Telugu. Now, let me give a brief introduction of some of the works that Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu has done on the Alankarashastra. And let me put a qualifier here. Of course, I'm not trained on Alankarashastra per se. Everything that I got to know on Alankarashastra has been based on the works of Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu, and somebody of my background and my age to really master all those Alankarashastras and then sit here and give a lecture. But what I'm going to do here is really take a very small book that Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu has written. It's just about 40-50 pages. And even for somebody who isn't really interested in mastering, let's say, Bhamaha's Kavya Alankara or Kuntaka's Vakrokti Jivanam, these are all classical works of Alankarashastra. There's a very small book that Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu has written, which says Alankarashastram and Adhunika Sahityam. So it's really about modern literature and Alankarashastram. This was a lecture that he gave a few years ago, and then it later published as a book. It's a very good book for somebody who doesn't know anything about Alankarashastram, but wants to understand what it is about and how to contextualize it in our modern times. So it's fascinating that Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu starts this book by saying that you might ask that why even read Alankarashastram for today's times? what is the role of something like Alankarashastra in today's times, where we have so many kinds of thoughts, right? I mean, there's somebody who says it's a Marxist thought, there is somebody who's saying Dalit literature, somebody says postmodernism, somebody says something else. So there's so many schools of thought, and why really Alankarashastra today? And I think that's where he makes a very poignant point that anybody who is writing something within the bounds of Varnamala, right, within the bounds of alphabets, the letters, and they are doing that to express a certain kind of meaning and evoke a certain kind of emotion in the audience. Anybody who is really doing that, if they want to do it effectively, then they need to understand Alankarashastra. So it's not something that is time bound. It's not something that is about a particular kind of work. Anybody who is trying to express something in a work of art, he says they'll benefit a lot by reading the Alankarashastra. In fact, he even says that you might even go and talk about, let's say, a Marxist idea or something like that, but you must still be benefiting from Alankarashastra because it really teaches you something about effective expression. And I think that is something that we all can really relate to, that these are really works that are not, I think at no point of time you can say they're outdated. It is really up to us to embrace these thinking and these Shastra works, and then trying to see how we can use it in our own life, be it as readers, be it as writers, and be it as people who are propagating forms of art and forms of culture. He takes a lot of these very popular lokas or uktis from, let's say, Upanishads, from Gita, from the Bhagavad Gita. This is something that a lot of people would know. They would have heard from multiple places through multiple forums. And then he starts dissecting them to say that you might have heard of this, and this is the Alankara in this. Then he gives a whole bunch of examples there to help people understand what these are, and to also validate his point or to substantiate his argument that this is not something that is bound by a certain kind of literature. He also takes examples, let's say, from Shakespeare, and then he quotes that even Shakespeare, when he is saying so and so in such and such manner, he's actually using this kind of Alankara. And a whole bunch of then contemporary Telugu poets like Devlapalli Krishna Shastri, Sri Arudra. It's interesting also that he brings in references to somebody like Panduranga P.V. Kane, who's of course very popular for his work on history of Dharma Sastras, and he also quotes widely from P.V. Kane's work on Alankarashastra Charitra, where he's written heavily on a lot of these Alankarashastra traditions. And it's also fascinating for somebody in our time to read all this, because a lot of these known luminaries in the Alankarashastra, they all hail from Kashmir. And to really relate to the classical Alankara tradition to Kashmir, to the likes of Anandavardhana, Abhinav Gupta, the fascination that comes out of reading these works is really to see that parampara, or to see that cultural continuity in various parts of India, where there's somebody sitting in Kashmir writing a work on Alankarashastra, and somebody decades later analyzing it, researching about it, and then that continues, right? So there's a whole geographical and cultural continuity within the country, and that kind of shows in some of these works on Alankarashastra. Now, there's another class of works of Sri Ramachandrudu Garu on Vyakarna Shastra, as I mentioned, where he has written a lot of commentaries, translations on works like Laghu Siddhanta Kaumudis, and he's also written heavily on Vedanta, where some of his translations on Upanishads are very popular in the Telugu states. So he has also written some translations of Shankara's Bhashyas on the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra, so on and so forth. And one unique aspect of how Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu engages with his audience is that though he is, let's say, translating an Upanishad, he writes this long 30-40 page forewords, which are called Prastavanas. In fact, there's a book that was published which says Pullela Vari Prastavanalu, which is a compendium of all these forewords that he has written for many of his works. And some of these Prastavanas are really very, very fascinating for somebody to read and understand, because even, let's say, you are not trained, or you are not in a position to understand the entire span of a particular Upanishad, you can still go through the Prastavana to understand why that needs to be read, what is the context of that particular Upanishad in the larger cultural space, who is the person who has written a Vyakya for this, what is the role of that person in the cultural continuum of the country. He's also very hardwired into some of the traditional thinking. So some of the things that he say, you can also relate it to what our traditional acharyas would be saying over time. In the case of the Upanishads, he has written this Prastavana where he clearly says that ideas of Swargam, Narakam, loosely translated as, let's say, heaven and hell, Punya, Papa, Atma, Anatma, these are all really the domain of what is called the Shabda Pramana, and it's not really the domain of what is called the Pratyaksha Pramana and Anumana Pramana. And he says that these are not like namesake truths, and there are indeed methods or sadhana, and then there's like methods of proof for all this, and it is for people who they should not just question these as namesake truths. You need to also engage with these traditions to also understand the sadhana aspect of it. And our philosophy nowhere is an armchair philosophy, and he quotes that in multiple places, that it's not like let's say a lot of some of the Western philosophy that you read. It is not just somebody sitting there and talking something without an associated corpus of how to realize these truths. And he keeps emphasizing these points all through his works everywhere, that the Indian method of understanding, the Indian method of probing is very different, and it's a misfortune really that a lot of people today read English translations or done by Indologists, so on, and they come up with various kinds of conclusions, which Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu writes a lot about in some of his works on Upanishads, on Brahma Sutra, so on, where people let's say read Shankaracharya and then they say that they it's like an understanding they get of Advaita based on turning a 3-4 pages on a PDF, and then they start talking about Shankaracharya, start talking about Advaita, and then all sorts of distortions come through. And Sri Ramachandrudu Garu is very clear and on these aspects, and he in fact refutes a lot of these arguments, a lot of these things that we hear in popular discourse, right? That Advaita has nothing to do with rituals, Advaita has nothing to do with temples, or Advaita has nothing to do with Purana, Itihasa, so on. So he refutes all of these, and a lot of scholars have done this, and Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu does it in his own unique way. And he clearly establishes this fact of how the Puranas, the Itihasas, the Upanishads, the various Upasana Padhatis, and the various Sampradayas we have, be it Smartha Sampradaya, the Shaiva Sampradayas, the Dvaita Sampradayas, and various other such Sampradayas, how there's a really Samanvaya that is possible across all of these, and how it's very really incorrect to look at these as so-and-so Acharya was against this Acharya, and so-and-so Sampradaya was against this Sampradaya. If you like this God, you cannot like that God. So read some of these works from somebody like him, because we have very few such authentic speakers or authentic writers these days who can stick to their roots on matters of tradition, and then really talk to the truth without worrying about, let's say, the political context, the social context, and all of these things. On this particular topic of Vedanta, I think Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu also very clearly makes points on another popular argument that we keep hearing, that the Bhakti tradition or the Bhakti Siddhanta was a later day addition. It wasn't there in the start, or let's say the Vaishnava religion is influenced by Islam. In fact, these are ideas that, let's say, you open a public internet forums like Twitter or Facebook, you might see somebody today saying something like, oh, this was influenced by Christ, and this was influenced by Islam, so on. And Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu writes at length on these topics, that these are all what he calls as apohas and distortions. And anybody who is seriously trying to engage with these texts will know in no time that all of these are really not necessarily true, and there is a way really to understand all of this. So there is also this popular accusation that Adi Shankaracharya is a Prachanna Bauddha, and there's a lot of people who have written at length on that topics. So Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu also takes all that, and he has written at length on also Buddhism and Jainism, and how they are not really very different, and from the Sanatana Dharma traditions. There are indeed some differences, but there are also several commonalities, and he tries to bring in that nuance through some of his works, and it's really fascinating for us to read because, as I mentioned, not many people can really say these things in public today due to various underlying currents on some of these heavily politicized topics of Buddhism and Jainism, where Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu really quotes in several places that today anybody who is against the idea of Hinduism, of certain aspects of Dharma, they bring up Buddhism and Jainism as if they are anti-Dharma, so to say. And he clearly says it's not correct. While it does, it might have helped some secular leaders or political leaders to sing along that kind of a story. That really doesn't make sense for anybody who seriously engages with this with the text. So I think it's very important for us to understand some of these works of Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu also in the context of the current socio-political environment. There is one particular book of his which has been widely acknowledged as one of his more popular works in the recent past, in the past couple of decades, which is this work on Sarvadarshana Sangraham, which is the Shayana Madhavacharya's work on all the Darshana philosophies in the country. And this is a book where it has been translated by multiple people in multiple languages, and this is the Sanskrit to Telugu translation of Sri Ramachandrudu Garu. And it's a very good primer for somebody who is just interested in knowing the core essence of our darshanas. And I think it is also something that, again, as with some of his works, it is not really meant for people who are already pandits, right? It is for people who want to learn. So in this book on Sarvadarshana Sangraham, he also talks about the historical context, Acharya Vidyaranya and Shayana Acharya and their entire work of how it was the Vijayanagara kingdom, it was under an onslaught, right? And as many of us are aware, he talks about the specific role that Vidyaranya has played in the establishment of that kingdom, the Bukarayalu, Harihararayalu. He talks about the works of Vidyaranya and then of Shayanacharya, and about the real impact of their contribution on the commentaries they have written on Veda Shastra, and then a whole bunch of books like that, which continue to be a staple for at least scholars for at least a few centuries now. A lot of people continue to rely on some of the work that has been done in that area. And he writes at length about the entire historical context and around the divine intervention, perhaps, that was around in correcting a lot of these historical wrongs. And in fact, in the Prastavana written for one of the books on Vidyaranya's works, Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu also talks about D.V. Gundappa, who is a very well-known Kannada scholar. And he quotes some of his lines on Vidyaranya to say how impactful the work and life of Vidyaranya has been for Hindus for centuries. And it's very fascinating to see these cross-referencing between two luminaries from the Kannada space and the Telugu space, and that continues to happen all through Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu's works. He quotes works from Marathi scholars, he quotes works from several other such scholars trained in the Indian languages. And I think that's a very fascinating continuing thread all through his works. Another work of his which is very popular and very widely referenced by many people for their own research is his work on Kautilya's Arthashastra, where Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu has taken some of the popular translations done in the past, let's say by people like R.P. Kangle, T. Ganpati Shastri, so on. And he has also added, of course, his own intellectual labor into this translation. And it's a very important translation to be read by people who are not trained in classical Sanskrit, because Arthashastra is a kind of work which has been seen all sorts of translations over the time. It's been very popular for about a century of the past century, where various kinds of scholars across various universities and even outside universities have tried to translate it and interpret it, and there are all sorts of distortions that have come out through the way. And it helps to read this kind of translation from somebody like Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu, where his vyakyanas on some of these really are very useful in understanding the true essence of the times that were, and to understand how to contextualize some of that works to our times now. So in the Prastavana written for this book, Also, Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu clearly talks about, let's say, how the Grihastha Ashrama was considered as very important for national security, even in those times by Kautilya. And he talks about how the Sannyasa Ashrama, which perhaps was had some influence of Buddhism, Jainism, so on. And there's explicit restrictions about how far sannyasis should be kept from the householders. If somebody really wants to become a sannyasi, then they need to ensure that they take care of their family, and there are explicit sanctions by Kautilya to say that if somebody becomes a sannyasi without taking care of their family, then they should have so and so punishment, danda, so on and so forth. So I think it's very interesting to for somebody to contextualize some of these works like that. And he also makes this very important point where a lot of people today especially in academia and even otherwise, they try to bring a kind of correlation or a relation between the role of Machiavelli's prince in the Western philosophy and the Western sphere of life, to say that Kautilya is the Indian Machiavelli, so on. And so it never made any sense for a lot of people, considering both the corpus of work and also the difference in the timelines, to really call Kautilya as the Indian Machiavelli. But that's the kind of times we live in. And of course, what the nuance that Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu brings into this is also that if you look at the work of Machiavelli's Prince, a lot of it is really about fear, where people need to be afraid of their king, and the sense of establishing order is really built around fear. And Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu also says there's also a sense of pessimism or a nirashavadam through the book. So he says it's not correct to compare that with Arthashastra, because though even in Arthashastra there's an aspect of fear, in the sense that he does talk about danda, which is a raja's or a king's ordinance and a king's a rule of establishing punishments for so and so misdeeds. But it's not only about that. Kautilya doesn't really try to establish order by means of fear, and he continues to emphasize a lot on how the unequal balance between dharma, artha, and kama is required for establishing shanti and for the welfare of the society, so on. And Kautilya really talks a lot about the role played by varna dharma and ashrama dharma and their role in social welfare. And for this because of this kind of nuance and because of this kind of variation in the works, I think Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu makes a very valid point that it's not correct to even draw these comparisons between these two, because there's also a whole paraloka aspect to this entire work on Arthashastra, and one cannot really correlate this kind of a paralaukika bhava with works that come out from the West, particularly works like The Prince. So he also quotes some of the Marathi scholars here, as I mentioned. So he quotes the work of S R Kulkarni to say that even let's say the reign of Chhatrapati Shivaji, the Rananiti or the Rajaniti, all that at that time also was influenced heavily by Arthashastra. And Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu says that not just this, there are several instances all across to see that the span of influence of Arthashastra is really huge. And he says that despite all this, there are still people who come back today and say that Indians didn't have a sense of governance, Indians didn't have a sense of polity, they didn't have a sense of taxation, so on and so forth. And he says it's very comical to see all of this because our tradition, if you look at the dating of some of these works on Arthashastra, they go back to centuries. And some of what you see in our epics like Mahabharata, in our own Smriti Vangmaya, in our own Shruti Vangmaya, you'd realize that it's definitely not a society that was backward. And he keeps reiterating this point all through his works. And he says that the onus is on us to engage with our own Shruti, Smriti, Itihasa, Purana, Vangmaya, so that we understand that the kind of sophistication we had on several matters, be it on governance, polity, on social welfare, these are not really things that somebody from outside need to come and teach to us. It is just about us having to stand back again on our foundation. And he keeps reiterating this point all across several of his works, particularly the ones that he has written on Smritis and Arthashastra and so on. He's also written at length, as I mentioned earlier, about on some of the classical works in Jainism and Buddhism. And these are really works that I could read only primarily because of the translations done by Sriramachandrudu Garu. It's really tough to catch hold of these books, even if you start reading them, it is difficult to continue for long. And all thanks to Sri Ramachandrudu Garu's translation, that I could really stay put on some of these books, which have a lot of dense prose, and it's very difficult to connect with them otherwise. So this particular work is Somadeva's Niti Vakyamrutam, which is some may say that it's also called a Rajaniti Sutra. So it is like the equivalent of perhaps the Arthashastra for the Jains. And this work is in the context of several Jain kingdoms in the Karnataka country, and this particular work has been again widely translated, and it's quite well known. So Sri Ramachandrudu Garu again here brings up this oft repeated point in his works, that right from your class 5 to your postgraduate, you are always told that Buddhism and Jainism are totally opposed to Dharma. And he says that anybody who actually reads books like these, and not just these and many more texts of Jainism and Buddhism, they will understand that the rules are really perhaps far more stricter in several aspects compared to what goes by as Sanatana Dharma. That in fact these religions perhaps are far stricter in several aspects, and some of the commonalities also are just stunning, and they cannot escape notice. So he says that it's very difficult for it's perhaps okay for non-serious readers to go by that narrative that they are totally squarely opposed to Sanatana Dharma, they're as separate as chalk and cheese. But if somebody engages with these texts, they would really understand that these particularly works like these on Niti Vakyamrutam or some other works on Buddhism that he quotes, there's several commonalities which nobody can escape. And in this case, he quotes some of the work written by K.K. Handiki, who is also a very famous scholar. We don't talk about him much, and I got to know of him only through this work. So K.K. Handiki also has a Padma Sri and a Padma Bhushan, well-known scholar on works of Indology, philosophy, so on. And he's written at length on Yashastilaka Champu, which is a work of the same time period as Somadeva, and in the authorship also is attributed widely to Somadeva. And in these works, you could see that a lot of the guidelines given to the Jain kings are also on respecting Varnashrama Dharma at some level, respecting the Jati Acharya and the Laukika Acharya, take it as a pramana, and don't mess with that kind of Acharya that is already in play, as long as it is not in conflict with some of the other values or guidelines given to the kings. So in that context, Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu says that it's not about him debating about the pros and cons of Varnashrama Dharma, but it is just to say that the Varnashrama Dharma continue to operate even in Jainist kingdoms reigned by Buddhist kings and the Jain kings, so on. And he also talks about quoting works from scholars like K.K. Handiki. He also talks about how fire worship was seen in South Indian Jains, how there are intertwining rules between Karnataka Jains and Gujarat Jains, and how there are Jain Kshatriyas, Jain Brahmins. It's not about trying to justify a certain kind of institution for these times. It is about understanding how things were. And it is important for us to acknowledge that these things did exist, that they were indeed intertwining rules. Even in the Jain communities, there were indeed some forms of fire rituals, even in the Jain communities, so on and so forth. And he also talks about how today we, on paper, we try to establish an equal society or an egalitarian society. And then despite that, there's a lot of economic inequality, which clearly shows up on the face for us, particularly in times like these, in times like crisis. And he says that while there are people who are trying to eliminate all these differences between various religions and various castes, as long as that doesn't succeed, the minimum that we need to ensure is that whatever equilibrium is there in the society today, we should not make it worse. There should not be more infighting, more differences, and then more discrimination than what was there before. So he keeps saying this point that whether you accept it or not, today there are thousands of jatis in this country, and I'm all good if somebody really succeeds in this project of eliminating all these jatis and establishing one. But until then, let's not make matters worse. So in that context, he also quotes of this line from P.V. Kane's History of Dharma Sastras, who in turn quotes L.P. Jacks on this line on social reform, which is quite popular and very important for this context. where he says that the social reform might be defined as the process of creating the social problems of tomorrow by acts of parliament designed to solve the problems of today. So you are trying to solve the problems of today, you make new laws, and they in turn create problems for tomorrow, and that's like an endless cycle. So I think P.V. Kane also puts it in that kind of a context. And it's very important because for us, as we see a lot of legislative changes happen all the time, and a lot of times they are counterproductive. And while he says this, Sri Ramachandru Garu also qualifies by saying that it doesn't mean that he's anti-change. He's not advocating that there should be no change in the society. If at all you have a certain well-established institution or a norm which was set for fulfilling a certain kind of a welfare aspiration, if it is not happening and if it is causing a certain kind of damage, then of course it needs to be corrected. But the whole idea behind the Niti Shastras, the Dharma Sutras, Dharma Shastras, so on, is about the first principles and about safeguarding these values. So you cannot do reform just for the sake of reform by letting go of all of these values. I think that's where he keeps emphasizing this point of us having to engage with our Smriti traditions, because today, while there's a lot of, particularly in the last decade or so, there's a lot of upswing in terms of traditional discourse. A lot of people really talking about itihasas, about Puranas, about bhashyas of Vedas, so on and so forth. But Smriti Vangmaya per se doesn't get as much attention because of again, several preconceived notions and several problematic concepts that people find for today's times. And Sri Ramachandru Garu has written at length on several of these Smriti works. And he keeps talking about the fact that we need to continue to engage with our Smriti tradition so that we don't lose sense of these principles and we don't slide into a kind of a moral degradation. He also really addresses some of the problems that we find today when we start reading Smritis, right? So Sri Ramachandru Garu says this in some of his commentaries that he has written on Yajnavalkya Smriti and Manusmriti, so on. That when people look at these Smriti Granthas today, they find some aspects which they don't like, and then the entire book becomes like a sort of something that should not be touched. It's like it becomes like a touch me not kind of a work. And he says that that's not the right way to look at these books, and it kind of reeks of presentism, where you are trying to do value judgment based on your own times. You should really port yourself to those times and then try to engage with these books. And he writes at length about how to do this samanvaya and how to understand these texts for our times today. So when he wrote this Prastavana for the Yajnavalkya Smriti, he also talks about the fact that a lot of us today reject these smritis, also not just because of these preconceived notions, also because a lot of us don't read the originals or don't read properly done translations, and people pick a paragraph here, paragraph there, and that sort of brings a color to that entire Smriti Grantha, and then we don't engage with it enough. In fact, he also talks about the flexibility of how the whole Varna Vyavastha operated, even if you go by the Smriti terms. He talks about how even in the Yajnavalkya Smriti, there are instances or there are explicit mentions of how a Varna changes after 5 generations, after 7 generations, of how there are like multiple kinds of Vivahas that are mentioned. So even if, let's say, there are 8 different kinds of Vivahas that are mentioned, a few might be recommended, but the others exist. So he brings this point that it's not to say that the others, the rules don't get broken. The rules may get broken, and there might be a new punishment, new exception, or a new mode of negotiating with it within the Smriti context. So he talks about several such exceptions, and particularly he writes at length about the idea of asprishyata, or which is loosely translated again as untouchability. That is something that has become this kind of there's a lot of guilt associated with the topic, and he in fact mentions that because of the guilt around that topic, people have really totally banished the Smriti discourse from outside popular discourse. And he talks at length about untouchability in several of his works, putting a historical context around how it came to be, and how several countries also had that kind of practices, and how in the last, let's say, 70-80 years, we have also reformed ourselves a lot. And he brings in this nuance in one of his works called Kaundinya Smriti, which is a Smriti Grantha that he wrote for the new times. I think it's a very fascinating attempt. I personally haven't heard of anybody from the traditional mold who has really attempted to do that, of trying to write a new Smriti for the modern times. And in this book on Kaundinya Smriti, he clearly mentions that if you go by the traditional notion of what is asaucha, like the ritual purity, there are several exceptions to it, that in terms of, let's say, there's a fire in the village, or there's an event, there's a Tirtha Yatra, or there's a Utsavam going on. There's a lot of exceptions given to the idea of what is Saucha, what is Asaucha. And he also mentions that a king can also decide by his own order or an ordinance that so and so cannot be treated as an Asaucha. It's very difficult if you don't go to your own tradition, your own books. Where do you get your values from? And he keeps bringing up this point in several of his works, that you cannot justify every degeneration that happens. You cannot call it a generation gap and ask people to just swallow it. There are first principles, there are values that we need to abide by and our aspire to abide by. So he keeps bringing that in a lot of these works. In Kaundinya Smriti, specifically, he also talks at length about the question of women, which is another such idea because of which people have sort of gone away from Smritis, that again, they take a paragraph here, take a paragraph there. He also brings this point again on the Varnashrama Vyavastha, that today we are told that there's a lot of discrimination because of caste, and there's a lot of infighting. The society was unstable. The society had a lot of issues in terms of equity, in terms of overall social welfare, well-being, so on, because of the Varna Vyavastha. And this being a Smriti Grantha, I think he had to address those topics. And he does bringing this point again, something that has been made by several other scholars before, that there has been no instance of like a coup d'etat or like a seizure of government where the entire people revolt against the government or take over the government because of caste discrimination or caste differences, so on. So I think it's important to understand all this, because today we have our own notions on this topic, and a lot of us have really moved away from tradition primarily because of this. Of course, Sri Ramachandrudu Garu also puts in a lot of qualifiers here, that kind of a vyavastha operated in a kind of an era where perhaps people didn't even step out of their village and move to another village, which is, let's say, 3-4 miles away. So it was a very self-contained and self-sufficient society. Of course, there were nagaras and kingdoms, so on, but predominantly there was the amount of movement that was happening was far lesser. And in his book on Kaundinya Smriti, he brings that topic again, that given in our times today, the times that have changed after the Industrial Revolution, it's a lot of movement, there's a lot of migration, and perhaps a lot of the ideas that were being prevalent before, it is very difficult to judge them or to even establish that kind of an order now, given this kind of movement. But then despite that, it's not like he's advocating some kind of a degeneration or anything. But I think that he brings in a lot of nuance, and I think that's one of the best expositions on this particular topic I have seen in recent past from somebody on the traditional mold. And in this context, he also, Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu also talks about why some of this also is so predominant in our minds today. Some of these preconceived notions also is because some of the translations done by Indologists and missionaries over time. In fact, he quotes from the works of Monier Williams, who is known for his Sanskrit dictionary, amongst other things, several others. And he quotes how Monier Williams himself talks about Colonel Broden, and explicit mention about a plot behind translating a lot of these religious works into Sanskrit, that they have motives of spreading Christian faith, so on and so forth. And Max Muller, for example, also again, I remember in my school times, in books, I remember Max Muller was introduced as a Sanskrit expert, but nobody ever told the rest of the story. And while several scholars have done it again in the recent past, and Sri Ramachandrudu Garu also explicitly mentions that in his book, some of the letters that Max Muller has written, where he explicitly talks about the vested agenda behind some of these works. Let's say between 2000 and 2015, like Kaundinya Smriti, he's written a book on Hindu Matam or Sanatana Dharma, and that's a book trying to compare like a study of comparative religion, somebody could say, of how it explains Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Jainism, so on. So about from 2000 to 2015, a lot of his works have been on topics like these. And he in fact makes an explicit mention of this in the book he wrote on Hindu Matam, to say that perhaps this is not the time for everybody to even indulge into Shastra research and Smriti research, so on. People should at least first know the fundamentals of what their religion even is, because today we are in a state where he talks about, in the context of a lot of conversion activity that is happening, and says that a lot of people really don't even know what their religion is about, and they just take to whatever the other person is saying, because their foundations themselves are so weak. And a lot of the work that he has done in the past a couple of decades are really around building these foundations and building an appreciation for some of this kind of work. And in fact, in the Prastavana to Kaundinya Smriti, he actually makes an explicit mention that while he might have spoken about a lot of topics on Varna, on Asprusyata, so on, as a part of what he called Prasanga Avesham, which is as a flow of thought, his real intent is really for to make the modern people know how a Smriti is written, so that they look at this book and understand what Smriti is about, and then they go back and start engaging with the entire Smriti corpus altogether. So it's not by any means all of what he has written, none of it is really prescriptive. It is more of a sense of understanding how things were and how things are, and based on that to understand how things ought to be in the future. And it's important to also acknowledge the changes that have happened in the past few decades and past few years. Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu also brings that about in a lot of his works, that this idea of Varna Sankaryam, Vritti Sankaryam, so on, there was perhaps never a perfect society where everything was so perfect. There were always ups and downs, there was always changes, and the tradition continued to negotiate with all of such, and try to accommodate all these changes without compromising on the first principles. He's also written at length on some of the Puranas. In fact, I think I remember reading long ago this work on Agni Purana that Pullela Sriramachandrudu has written. It was a chance discovery for me on the Kanchikamakoti site, where they had listed some of these Puranas, and it's available for free reading for anybody. And so Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu has also in the Prastavana for this explained at length of how to understand Puranas. And again, I think that's another topic that gets a lot of abuse these days, where people don't understand a lot of nuance there, and they mess up the timelines, they mess up the core message, and then we get into these debates of what is mythology, is Purana mythology, is myth real, is history real, and then they try to historicize Puranas. It's a lot of complication on a lot of all of these works. And I think reading some of these commentaries from somebody like Sriramachandrudu Garu is very helpful, as he perhaps is away from all of this noise. In fact, he mentions in works, in some of his works, that you perhaps should not spend as much time in the media listening to news and all these things. He talks about that being Kakadanta Nyaya, which is like trying to count, check whether the crow has teeth, and try to count the number of teeth for the crow. It's a futile exercise, and it's more important for us to engage with our own topics than to engage in other topics like these. So in this work on Purana, he also talks about how one should not, a certain Purana might be talking about a certain god, and that doesn't mean that the other gods are not good or less worthy, so on. So he keeps referring to this, that Nahi Ninda Nyayam, which he talks about in his works, that just because you denigrate something in a certain context doesn't mean that it is bad. It is really that denigration is only because you want to show that something else is important. So in a particular, let's say you are doing a particular, the Purana mentions a particular Vratam, it might say that this Vratam is the best of all, but it really doesn't mean that all other Vratams are not good. It is just that in that context of that Sampradaya or that worship, that Vratam has value. And at that point in time, the focus is on that Vratam, so it is shown as its best. So he makes this point that that's how somebody needs to understand also these various traditions that we have of worshipping Shiva, worshipping Ganesha, worshipping Vishnu, and various variations we have all across. Any single Purana, if you take, it might appear that they are trying to talk about one god, and they are trying to make the the other gods as less worthy. But he keeps says that where the idea of Bhagavan or the idea of Parameshwara is really beyond all these, and there's a confluence or a samanvaya possible across all these ideas. And he says that's really the right way to read all of these Puranas, and not to get into these discussions of my Purana is good, your Purana is bad, or my Sampradaya is great, your Sampradaya is not great. And he also brings this point in his works on Shankaracharya's various translations that he has done, that a lot of people today might also take Shankaracharya and then take Ramanujacharya or take Madhvacharya and then say all sorts of things. But there is indeed a kind of way to look at all of those works, all of those differing traditions for somebody who looks at it from outside. But there is indeed a way to understand all of these parallel streams of thoughts and how they all converge into a certain kind of reality. And I think it's very important for us to engage with this kind of commentary because there's a lot of information overload in our times today, and it is very important for us to decide what to pick and what not to pick. Now, let me end this particular talk by quickly talking about a couple of works again written by Sriramachandrudu Garu in the last, let's say, in the last 10 years or so of his life, where there's this book he has written called Mahabharata Sara Sangraham, which is a 1,000-page work trying to summarize several noteworthy aspects of Mahabharata. And then he explains the reason for writing this book is also because a lot of people might have read Ramayana, but they may not have read Mahabharata because it's much, much larger in terms of size than Ramayana. And he writes this Mahabharata Sara Sangraham so that people understand the summary of Mahabharata, so to say, and then take it from there, and then hopefully put in the efforts to understand the full Mahabharata end to end. And even there, he talks about why people today also don't seem to take to Mahabharata, again, because of similar reasons, that they don't like certain aspects, that somebody might say, oh, there is a mention of Pashubali there, or there is a mention of why did Draupadi marry so many people? Why are there unnatural births? I don't believe in all this. How can somebody just be born in so and so way? Why does it talk about the Shakti of mantras? How can humans communicate with devatas? So he says that there are all sorts of these misconceptions that are around, and we are not looking at them the right way. And if we ourselves don't engage with these texts on Mahabharata and Ramayana, he says it is very difficult to imagine an India without Mahabharata and Ramayana. He has again written a very beautiful Prastavana to that book on why one should read Ramayana for today's times. And he also makes this point that in times like today, where people are, for the slightest of difficulty, you see people committing, like attempting suicide, or for the slightest of anger, you see somebody trying to kill somebody else. And there's like the ability of us as a generation to take to survive and to live through various trials and tribulations that has weakened. And he says that our own epics like Ramayana can really teach you a lot of fortitude and how to survive through a lot of difficulties through the life, and about what is the right life, what is Sanmarga, so on. And he also talks about how the values in Ramayana, like about the Dampatya Sambandham, or the value or the purity of living that kind of a life, is also coming to question today, because today we adulate a lot of Western countries as the altar of civilization. And if you look at what happens there, there's a frequent what he calls as Vivaha Vichedam, Punarvivaham, so on. It's not a moral judgment really in today's times, but it's more of, there is a contrast of the ideals that we cherished as a civilization that prided on Ramayana versus what is happening today across the world is very different. And he tries to bring that point that Ramayana, he says, has a lot of what he calls as Sanmarga Pradarshaka Deepalu, which is light which shows to you the right path. I'm hoping that through this introductory talk, a lot of people who know Telugu and haven't read Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu will start engaging with him or even with other traditional scholars. And those of you who are probably not from the Telugu country also can really go back to your own native language, be it Kannada, be it Marathi, be it Hindi. You would find of traditional scholars who has written a lot of literature on our own Purana, Itihasa, Smriti, Shruti, so on. And you will perhaps engage with it. We will hopefully see over time that today we have a discourse that happens in English, and there's a discourse that happens in Sanskrit, and probably far less of it that happens in Matrubhasha. And you'll probably see a lot of people trying to embrace their own native languages and perhaps also produce work in their own native languages. So that's really been the intent of this talk. Again, it's just a small tribute. As I mentioned, Pullela Sriramachandrudu Garu is a very, very widely accomplished scholar, and there have been several people, professors, scholars who have done research on his own works. There have been seminars, national level seminars conducted on his work. Thank you to Atharva Forum. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity.